A sharp, piercing sound tore through the night. A dim yellow light cast shadows across a floor stained with blood. A child lay motionless, eyes wide open, while a man holding an AR-15 stood silently among the bodies. He turned and gave a twisted smile. Outside, a neighbor's scream echoed, then fell silent. It all happened in just a few minutes. And then, police stormed the house, a place that, less than 30 minutes earlier, had been a family home. Now, only cold bodies remained. Who had killed their own flesh and blood? And why? 2 spent 5.56 millimeter casings were found lodged beneath the leg of a plastic children's chair. Blood spatter on the east wall suggested a close-range discharge, with vertical projection indicating the victim had been seated at the time of impact. The pattern of arterial spray across the adjacent crib aligns with a high-velocity gunshot injury to a child under 2 years old. Multiple bodies were located in spatial proximity, consistent with minimal victim movement prior to impact. There were no defensive wounds recorded on any of the corpses examined at the Schoolhouse Lane residence. The configuration of the deceased, 3 adult females and 5 children, exhibited no indications of resistance or attempted flight. The absence of forced entry or overturned furniture eliminates the likelihood of an external assailant or prolonged confrontation. The point of origin, determined by the trajectory and distribution of ballistic fragments, confirmed that the shooter began the assault from within the central living space. All victims were known associates of George Emil Banks, either as cohabitants or biological offspring. Preliminary forensic photography documented Banks standing at the threshold with the AR-15 rifle lowered. Multiple witnesses from the surrounding trailer park later reported a flat, unchanging facial expression. A neighbor's testimony, later entered into the trial record, described Banks's behavior as methodical, noting that he stepped over bodies without altering pace. Eyewitness accounts align with the detachment from environmental stimuli during the event sequence. The volume of ammunition expended, calculated from recovered casings and weapon residue, confirmed the shooter reloaded at least once inside the property. This procedural act, coupled with the anatomical targeting of non-ambulatory children, supports the hypothesis of planned annihilation rather than spontaneous escalation. No apparent delay occurred between the initial attack and subsequent phases of the spree, indicating uninterrupted intent. Banks departed the property using a vehicle owned by one of the deceased, further eliminating the probability of panic-based action. No valuables were removed from the premises. The absence of any communicative statement or written justification at the scene excludes post hoc rationalization as a motivating component. Law enforcement response was activated following the discovery of 2 adult male gunshot victims near the property perimeter. These injuries, though sustained off-site, were later confirmed to originate from the same shooter and ammunition type. Their inclusion in the sequence suggests an expanded operational scope and continuation of the original directive beyond the domestic sphere. All observed behavior, lack of concealment, precision targeting of kin, sustained aggression over multiple locations, corresponds with a behavioral profile categorized as family annihilation with ideological reinforcement. The selection of victims, all within Banks's psychological and physical control, implies an internalized belief in the legitimacy of the act rather than a loss of control. The absence of reactive behavior at the initial crime scene, both from victims and from the perpetrator post-discharge, could imply a coercive context that neutralized typical fight-or-flight response. This condition warrants further investigation into the psychological dynamics within the residence prior to the event. George Emil Banks was born on June 22, 1942, in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, to a white mother and a black father. Census and community records from the period confirm the local African American population was under 1%. This demographic isolation formed the early context of Banks's identity formation. Witness reports and later psychiatric evaluations noted Banks demonstrated pre-adolescent signs of racial confusion and low self-acceptance. Several sources documented early verbalized resentment toward both white and black peer groups. This pattern suggests chronic identity dissonance, reinforced by the social conditions of a racially polarized community. School disciplinary records and interviews with former educators indicate low academic engagement and increased behavioral disruptions, beginning at age 12. Multiple incidents involved defiance, minor vandalism, and verbal aggression toward authority figures. No clinical diagnoses were recorded at the time. However, retrospective evaluations point to possible early-stage oppositional, defiant behaviors. Banks exited the public school system before graduation. At age 18, he enlisted in the U.S. Army. Service records show a short tenure marked by disciplinary citations. His inability to tolerate structured authority was cited in his early discharge. Behavioral inconsistencies were noted, including an exaggerated response to minor commands and distrust of senior officers. This trajectory is consistent with individuals who exhibit authoritarian reversal, an intense need to dominate others while rejecting imposed structure. Upon discharge, Banks returned to Wilkes-Barre with no employment or long-term stability. In 1961, Banks was arrested during a failed robbery attempt involving a firearm. Ballistic reports confirmed he discharged a weapon, injuring the bar owner at close range. Court documents referenced signs of impulsivity and poor situational awareness. He received a 5 to 7 year sentence. During his incarceration, prison logs recorded one escape attempt during a supervised work detail. His recapture occurred within hours, but the act resulted in an extended sentence. Over time, prison psychological assessments noted improved behavior but persistent signs of paranoid ideation. After his release in the early 1970s, Banks reintegrated into civilian life with minimal external monitoring. Despite his felony record, employment was secured at the state correctional institution at Camp Hill, where he served as an armed tower guard. The assignment provided him with routine access to firearms and minimal interpersonal supervision. Colleague reports described him as isolated, controlling, and prone to unsolicited political commentary. Notably, Banks began expressing beliefs in racial conflict scenarios, including references to a coming war involving systemic extermination of minorities. Housing records show he established residence at Schoolhouse Lane and formed non-marital cohabitation relationships with multiple women. All were younger, some significantly. Banks fathered multiple children across these relationships. Social services received no formal complaints from residents in the household, though neighbors periodically reported hearing verbal altercations. This outward compliance, paired with internal dominance, suggests a closed system dynamic, where control was maintained without external intervention. By mid-1982, Banks had been placed on medical leave from his correctional post. Official documentation cites psychological concerns, including the risk of self-harm. During this period, he began stockpiling ammunition and reading paramilitary literature. Multiple acquaintances later reported that he believed his children would become targets due to their mixed racial identity. He vocalized intentions to prevent them from experiencing what he did. The fixation on preserving his children through terminal means indicates a delusional protective schema, with self-justified violence framed as preemptive salvation. His journal entries during this time referenced surveillance, betrayal, and cleansing. The lack of external consultation, combined with isolation, created a closed-loop confirmation system. No therapeutic intervention was continued following his removal from the prison post. Law enforcement and mental health agencies had no concurrent reports of high-risk behavior. This void allowed escalating pathology to proceed undetected. The convergence of racialized paranoia, prior institutionalization, authority rejection, and sudden occupational displacement formed the backdrop of Banks's eventual behavioral collapse. While no single factor establishes causation, the accumulation of unresolved identity, fragmentation, and unmoderated delusion contributed to a high-risk psychological profile. The absence of documented efforts by institutional actors to assess his deteriorating worldview, despite clear behavioral markers, raises procedural concerns. Further evaluation is necessary to determine whether the lack of intervention reflects systemic oversight or deficiencies in interagency communication protocols. At approximately 2:30 a.m. on September 25, 1982, George Emil Banks initiated a sequence of targeted lethal actions at his residence on Schoolhouse Lane in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Forensic documentation confirms the use of an AR-15 rifle with a high-capacity magazine. All victims at the residence were shot at close range, with entry wounds indicating minimal resistance. The rapid succession of impacts and absence of secondary injury patterns support a scenario of low-motion, low-reaction environment. 8 fatalities were recorded at this location, including 3 adult females and 5 minors. All victims were either cohabitants or offspring of the perpetrator. The physical arrangement of the bodies, the spatial distribution of shell casings, and the consistent downward trajectory of the rounds suggest a methodical progression from one room to the next. No evidence of property disturbance or structural damage was found, which rules out forced entry or altercation. The precision and focus on known individuals indicate an intentional and predetermined sequence, rather than chaotic escalation. The behavioral choice to begin the sequence within a domestic environment containing dependents aligns with family annihilator typologies. The absence of verbalized threats or warnings, as reported by surviving community witnesses, reinforces the theory of concealed premeditation rather than impulsive action. Within 30 minutes of the first killings, Banks proceeded to the Heather Highlands trailer residence, approximately 4 miles from the primary scene. This location was occupied by a former intimate partner, Sharon Mazzillo, and multiple minors, including at least one biological child of Banks. Based on witness testimony and surviving victim statements, Banks gained entry without physical resistance and discharged the weapon multiple times. 3 individuals were confirmed deceased at this second site: Sharon Mazzillo, her mother Alice, and 1 minor. The method of entry, absence of signs of forced access, and selection of targets suggest that Banks maintained a consistent behavioral logic centered on terminating individuals within his perceived familial domain. Notably, 2 children survived by remaining hidden during the assault. Their location, under furnishings and out of visual line, may have contributed to their exclusion from the kill pattern. This selective termination reinforces a hypothesis of control-oriented targeting rather than indiscriminate violence. After exiting the trailer, Banks was observed by witnesses as being physically stable, with no visible signs of disorientation. He made verbal references to having finished everything, which were later cited during psychiatric evaluations. These statements imply a goal-completion framework, where the perpetrator understood the killings as the culmination of a defined objective. This cognitive framing is consistent with delusional systems that incorporate terminal logic, often seen in ideologically motivated familial homicides. Following the second attack, Banks relocated to a known associate's vacant property on Monroe Street. There, he implemented a barricade strategy, placing furniture against entry points and positioning reflective surfaces near windows. The placement of mirrors and the centralized positioning near a second-floor window suggest defensive posturing coupled with anticipatory behaviors. It is likely that Banks anticipated law enforcement engagement and was preparing for either confrontation or self-termination. Throughout the standoff that followed, law enforcement negotiators reported verbal exchanges marked by references to racial injustice, imminent civil conflict, and perceived betrayal by society. Banks repeatedly asked whether his children had survived. The recurring nature of this inquiry suggests cognitive dissonance between the executed acts and a residual need for emotional validation or denial of responsibility. His refusal to surrender initially, despite prolonged isolation and tactical disadvantage, indicates a psychological investment in a final outcome that excluded survival. The operational consistency across 3 locations, the continued focus on familial targets, and the absence of monetary or sexual motives indicate a behavioral pattern rooted in ideologically structured annihilation. The progression from domestic homicide to standoff behavior reflects a transition from private execution to public confrontation, a shift often associated with perpetrators seeking control over the narrative of their actions. Banks surrendered voluntarily approximately 9 hours after initiating the first shooting. The final decision to submit to arrest rather than force lethal engagement with police may reflect a deterioration in resolve or the influence of residual relational bonds. The recorded behavioral sequence does not fully align with standard suicide by cop patterns, particularly given the duration of the standoff and the presence of self-preserving actions during negotiation. The absence of psychotic break indicators during these events, despite ideological fixation and delusional justification, suggests a complex interplay between structured cognition and pathological belief systems. Whether his behavioral restraint at the final stage reflects adaptive calculation or emotional fatigue remains a subject of forensic psychological interest. By late 1982, multiple behavioral indicators suggest that George Emil Banks had developed a rigid and increasingly delusional worldview centered around racial conflict, perceived persecution, and a self-ascribed protective duty. Documentation recovered post-arrest, including handwritten notes, magazines with annotated passages, and verbal statements recorded during the standoff, reveal the presence of a structured belief system. Central to this system was the conviction that an imminent and violent race-based collapse of societal order was unavoidable. Banks's fixation on racial identity began in childhood, intensified during his time in military custody, and became ideologically crystallized in the years following his employment at the Camp Hill Correctional Facility. Witnesses from that period described a notable shift in his rhetoric. He began referencing what he termed the coming race war, a phrase he used frequently in conversations with co-workers and intimate partners. His language incorporated themes of ethnic cleansing, betrayal by both black and white populations, and the belief that biracial children, particularly his own, would be uniquely victimized. This ideation appears to have functioned as a justification framework. Banks came to interpret his role as simultaneously defensive and preemptive. Statements made during the Monroe Street standoff support this hypothesis. He described his killings as necessary acts to prevent his children from being subjected to racial persecution. He expressed the belief that death was preferable to their future suffering, suggesting a logic of terminal protection rooted in delusional altruism. There is no indication that these beliefs were externally reinforced. Interviews with former associates indicate that Banks did not participate in organized extremist groups or political cells. The insularity of his ideology, combined with a pattern of selective exposure to survivalist and militarized publications, points to self-radicalization. The lack of peer challenge and external ideological feedback likely allowed unchecked cognitive drift into extremism. Psychological records reviewed after the fact reveal no active psychiatric treatment during the period leading up to the offense. Internal prison documents referenced emotional instability, but did not trigger mandated psychiatric intervention. No formal diagnosis was recorded, though retrospective evaluations suggest that Banks exhibited signs consistent with paranoid delusional disorder. The presence of persecutory delusions, fixed ideological beliefs, and absence of reality testing support this classification. Notably, Banks did not exhibit disorganized thinking in traditional clinical terms. His behavior remained linear, task-oriented, and goal-directed throughout the sequence of events. This distinction is critical. It suggests a high-functioning psychotic profile in which executive functioning and planning remained intact, allowing for controlled and systematized implementation of violent ideation. The decision to target only individuals within his familial and relational orbit indicates that Banks maintained a narrow interpretation of threat. He did not attack institutions, law enforcement, or random community members. This containment suggests that his delusional framework positioned himself as both cause and solution to a perceived existential crisis. The killings were not expressive acts of rage, but instrumental measures within an internal logic of elimination. Verbal content extracted from negotiations confirms that Banks experienced ongoing cognitive dissonance. He alternated between affirming responsibility for the murders and questioning the survival of his victims. This inconsistency may reflect a psychological split between the ideological justification of the act and the residual emotional ties to the victims. The persistence of this dissonance during post-event phases indicates a failure to fully integrate the consequences of his behavior into his belief structure. No evidence suggests that Banks anticipated legal or moral absolution. His journal entries and verbalized intentions included expectations of personal death following the act. However, his failure to initiate self-termination during the final stage of the standoff may indicate a collapse in the ideologically sustained suicidal logic. The hesitation introduces a behavioral inconsistency that remains unaccounted for. While the overarching belief in a racial apocalypse served as the primary motivational structure, additional factors, including prior institutional rejection, economic instability, and social alienation, likely compounded Banks's susceptibility to rigid ideation. The exclusive targeting of those under his authority suggests a motive linked not only to racial ideology, but also to control, possession, and the elimination of perceived future vulnerability. The absence of post-homicidal ritual, public manifesto, or symbolic messaging suggests that the killings were not communicative, but existential in purpose. Banks did not attempt to influence external opinion or mobilize ideological allies. His framework of justification remained internalized and functionally self-contained. Further analysis is required to determine whether his final decision to surrender represents a breakdown in delusional conviction, a reassertion of normative cognition, or a tactical maneuver unrelated to belief. This ambiguity in behavioral closure presents a key area for ongoing forensic psychological review. George Emil Banks was formally charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder following his arrest on September 25, 1982. The trial commenced on June 6, 1983, at the Luzerne County Courthouse in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Court records document that Banks entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. Expert testimony was presented from both prosecution and defense-appointed forensic evaluators. Although clinical indicators of paranoid delusion were acknowledged, the jury found that Banks possessed sufficient cognitive capacity to understand the nature and consequences of his actions at the time of the offenses. He was convicted on 12 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of third-degree murder, along with multiple related offenses including attempted murder and aggravated assault. The jury recommended the death penalty for the capital charges. Sentencing was carried out in accordance with Pennsylvania law. Subsequent appeals cited claims of mental incompetence and constitutional violations, but were unsuccessful in overturning the convictions. In 2010, a judicial determination declared Banks incompetent for execution due to chronic mental illness. As of the latest review, he remains incarcerated under life custody without the possibility of parole. Victim impact statements submitted during sentencing hearings reflect ongoing psychological trauma among surviving family members and community residents. Interviews conducted with emergency responders and investigators decades later reveal residual emotional desensitization, sleep disturbances, and behavioral hypervigilance. These outcomes are consistent with long-term secondary trauma exposure, particularly among individuals involved in the initial scene response and post-incident processing. The socio-cultural effect of the killings within the Wilkes-Barre area persisted through institutional responses and public discourse. Local school systems implemented crisis response policies in the years following, including staff training in behavioral threat assessment. Law enforcement agencies in Luzerne County revised interdepartmental coordination protocols for high-risk domestic environments. However, there is no evidence that a formal early warning system for ideologically motivated familial violence was established as a result of this case. Forensic analysis of Banks's behavior during the legal process indicates continued ideological fixation. Statements made during psychiatric evaluations and legal depositions show no substantial deviation from his original narrative. He maintained that the murders were acts of protection rather than aggression. This persistent cognitive framework, combined with a lack of emotional responsiveness, supports the presence of chronic, fixed delusions rather than episodic psychosis. Media coverage at the time of the trial emphasized the brutality of the crimes, but provided limited examination of the psychological mechanisms underlying the event. The absence of in-depth behavioral analysis in early reporting may have contributed to public perception of the case as an isolated anomaly, rather than as a complex intersection of identity, delusion, and control-based violence. The legacy of the case presents ongoing relevance in the study of ideologically motivated intrafamilial homicide. The offender's lack of affiliation with structured extremist groups, combined with high-functioning daily behavior prior to the event, challenges standard predictive models of mass violence. Additionally, the absence of communicative or performative elements in the killings distinguishes this case from ideologically expressive homicides and mass casualty events motivated by public messaging. Banks's actions reveal a pattern of internalized justification operating within a closed cognitive system, wherein perceived racial injustice, distorted familial obligation, and rigid moral logic merged to form a lethal directive. His behavioral trajectory does not conform fully to typologies of spree killers, mission-oriented offenders, or psychotic disorganizers. The case, therefore, occupies a hybrid space that resists categorical simplification. The implications for behavioral threat assessment are considerable. This case underscores the necessity of integrating identity-based fixation, non-affiliated radicalization, and ideologically framed protective violence into forensic screening models. It also reveals the limitations of relying on outward social deviance as a precursor to high-risk behavioral escalation. The events initiated by George Emil Banks resulted in lasting psychological, institutional, and analytical consequences. While the legal process achieved formal resolution, the behavioral dimensions of the case remain instructive for future application in criminal profiling, preventive intervention, and system-wide response to low-visibility ideological violence.